So people often ask, why study history? It happened so long ago, like it doesn't really relate to the real everyday life, does it? And the answer is yes. All right. As a former social studies teacher, I'm a huge history buff, right? And I don't know if you've been watching the news, but currently we have had a lot of energy inside the democratic process here in the country, right? You think a lot of that to President Trump, whether you love him or hate him, all right? He has brought out a lot of passion from both sides of the aisle, right? And I was reading an article today, and recently, we've had Antifa, in groups like Antifa come out and, cause a lot of disrest, in certain communities for trying to get their voice out, kind of assembling in certain areas. Some people support it, some people don't support it. And then today, over the summer, let me back up. Over the summer, Sarah Sanders, who is the press secretary of the United States president, kind of got booted out from, a restaurant from people who didn't support President Trump. And Maxine Waters, a congresswoman, has kind of gone on record supporting people confronting public officials, and voicing their opposition. All right. And then today I read in the article or the paper that Mitch McConnell was approached by some opposition people, who don't support his policies. And it really came to a head with Brett Kavanaugh. If you know who Brett Kavanaugh is, who is our newest Supreme Court justice, right? You had a lot of protests, you had a lot of assemblies for or against his nomination for Supreme Court justice, which he eventually did achieve. And the reason why I bring this up is there's a quote from Thomas Jefferson that talks about democracy and mob rule, because this is an issue that the founders worried about, how mob rule or the public can influence, the government, right? And is that a good thing and is that a bad thing? That's kind of a question for you to think about, but it reminds me back to Daniel Shays. If you know who Daniel Shays is, here's a quick little history lesson for you. Okay, Daniel Shays, he was a farmer in, I believe, Massachusetts, right, during the Revolutionary War days. And during the Revolutionary War, right, we had the Continental Congress, and the Continental Congress had soldiers, right, and they were fighting this war against the British. Okay, well, after the war was so during the war, right, these farmers had to grow food and supplies because we had to replenish all of these armies that we had, fighting the British and all these soldiers. Well, so farmers are buying supplies and land and expanding and yada, 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 right? And Congress is going to pay them back. Well, the war ends, okay? And once the war ends, okay, Congress doesn't really have a lot of money because they can't tax, first off, which was a problem, okay? And now all these farmers have expanded and grown, crops and all this stuff. Well, their market where they're selling their products is gone, okay? The soldiers are gone, right? So they have a surplus of stuff, right? And they have all this debt. The debt that the government, in their opinion, was trying to get them to take on in order to help supply their soldiers, the government soldiers, with food and supplies. Well, now they couldn't pay their debt because the war was over. Continental Congress had no money. It couldn't tax. And the farmers, the people who did this to help the country, were now on the hook with the bill, right? And courthouses were condemning and closing on farms because the farmers could not pay off their debt. Well, Daniel Shays, and a group of people, right, started protesting and closing down courthouses and rebelling, right? And some people were like, yay, good job for Shays, freedom of expression, and this is, good to get your voice heard, that kind of thing, right? And some people, especially in the government, were worried, right? They were like, all this unrest, all this civil unrest, people from the, average citizens, that's not good for the country. We don't want that, okay? Well, Jefferson and some of the other founding fathers, they didn't really necessarily think that was a bad thing, right? And so I'm having that connection to today because we hear civil unrest, whether it's immigration, whether it's the tax thing. Well, there was a Supreme Court thing, right? There's a lot of, I don't want to use the word protest, right? I don't like the word mob, but you do hear that in the news, right? But you hear a lot of this energy inside the country politically, and it's very divisive, meaning like they're always butting up against each other. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens, right? Because history does repeat itself, and Shays' Rebellion, did cause huge historical ramifications. It was a trigger, for big changes needed in the government, right? I don't necessarily think I'm not trying to say that's where we're going, but it is interesting, right, how there is that connection, and people often wonder why study history. Well, maybe that's a good example. So, I don't know. Take time, think about, do you approve of that message that Maxine Waters has said, where you should approach people in the Trump, cabinet and administration with opposition and kind of heckle them? Do you not support that? Like many people do too. It's really your opinion, but just kind of keep an eye on the culture of the U.S. and how it is kind of interesting. All right. See ya.